One could literally see every single bone in his body, and the bones were as if it were a skeleton. And I'd literally never seen anything like that before.
Toronto, which is Canada's largest city, is a vibrant and diverse metropolis with a rich history dating back to its Indigenous roots and later European settlement. The area became a hub of trade and culture before the British established the town of York in 1793. It was later renamed Toronto in 1834 and grew into a thriving economic and cultural centre, now home to nearly 3 million people. Nestled within Toronto's East End, Woodfield Avenue is a quiet residential street near Woodbine Beach, lined with charming homes and tree-shaded sidewalks. The neighbourhood is known for its family-friendly atmosphere, with easy access to parks, schools, and the bustling shops and cafes along Queen Street East. But one fateful morning in November of 2003, the serenity of Woodfield Avenue was shattered by a desperate 911 call. The voice on the other end of the line was urgent, as they reported that a child was unresponsive. Paramedics and police rushed to the home, unaware that they were stepping into a case that would send shockwaves through Ontario's child welfare system. What they would uncover inside that modest home would not only raise questions about the safeguards in place for vulnerable children, but also lead to sweeping reforms. Jeffrey Baldwin hadn't had the best start in life. Born on the 20th of January 1997 in Toronto, he entered the world facing challenges most children never would. Developmentally delayed and vulnerable, Jeffrey's life was shaped by instability from the very beginning. His teenage parents, Yvonne Kidman and Richard Baldwin, struggled with their own demons. Yvonne was only 16 years old when she gave birth to her first child, a baby girl she named Sarah. But motherhood was short-lived. Sarah was taken from Yvonne's care after she was found left alone in a crib while Yvonne fought Richard outside on the street. Then Jeffrey was born, and by the time he was 1 year old, the cycle repeated itself. The Catholic Children's Aid Society removed Jeffrey and his sister Laura from their parents' care. There had been alleged incidents of domestic violence and a disturbing incident at their welfare office. Yvonne had allegedly been seen aggressively shaking Jeffrey. Then there were allegations that their living situation was squalid and that the children had no bedtime routine. The intervention was meant to protect them, to offer them a better life. They were placed in the care of their maternal grandparents, Alva Bottineau and Norman Kidman. In time, Jeffrey's younger brother Julian also joined them, along with their oldest sister. Jeffrey at the time was a cute, cherubic little baby with curly blonde hair. He was an active boy who always wanted hugs and kisses. All 4 siblings were now under their grandparents' roof, where they were supposed to be safe. But not all homes are sanctuaries, and not all families offer love. The morning of the 30th of March 2002 began with a desperate 911 call. Alva Bottineau, Jeffrey Baldwin's grandmother, was on the other end of the line. Her voice was calm, almost detached, as she told the dispatcher that her grandson had stopped breathing. She mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that he hadn't been eating very well lately. The 911 operator's questions were sharp, laced with concern. Had he choked? Had something blocked his airway? Bottineau hesitated. She explained that she had given Jeffrey some milk and bread and that he had eaten it. But in the past few days, she said, he had stopped eating and had stopped drinking. That didn't make sense to the 911 operator. Young children don't just stop breathing. Again, the operator pressed. Had he choked? Bottineau wavered. He could have, she said, but quickly dismissed the idea. Instead, she suggested that he had a touch of the flu. Her words were troubling. If the child wasn't breathing, why wasn't she more panicked? The dispatcher instructed her to check for signs of life, to put her ear next to Jeffrey's mouth to watch for the rise and fall of his chest. "He does have a little movement in him," Botno replied, her voice still oddly indifferent. "And that's just about the best I can tell you right now. Right now, I'm just a little scared," she said. The ambulance raced towards the home on Woodfield Avenue, sirens cutting through the cold morning air. As soon as the paramedics stepped inside, they were hit with an overpowering stench, a thick, suffocating mixture of urine and faeces. The smell clung to the walls, the floor, the very air they breathed. Guided into the kitchen, their eyes landed on a small figure lying motionless on the counter wrapped in a towel. It was Jeffrey. The boy was unresponsive, his frail body eerily still. The paramedics turned to Botno and asked about his medical history. "His history's fine," she said flatly, as if none of this was unusual. Despite the fact that Jeffrey was fighting for his life, Botno seemed more preoccupied with an upcoming job interview. Then a man shuffled into the room, rubbing the sleep from his eyes. It was Norman Kidman, Jeffrey's grandfather. He barely spared a glance at the dying child before groggily complaining to the paramedics. "He still pees and poops in his bed," he muttered, pointing to Jeffrey. It was then that the paramedics understood. They weren't looking at a simple medical emergency. Something was terribly, terribly wrong. Jeffrey's body told the truth his grandparents refused to speak. He was skin and bones, with his limbs frail and his face hollow. His eyes, which were sunken deep into his skull, stared blankly. His tiny body bore the unmistakable signs of starvation. He was very, very thin, extremely malnourished, paramedic Robert Selfridge would later recall. Jeffrey was scooped up and rushed to the waiting ambulance. But when the paramedics turned to Botno and Kidman and asked who would accompany him, neither of them stepped forward. Jeffrey went alone. At the hospital for sick children, the full extent of his suffering was laid bare. His tiny frame was covered in bruises. His cheeks and eyes were sunken. Loose skin sagged from his emaciated body. A thick layer of bacteria clung to his skin. Sores festered on his buttocks and genitals. His belly was bloated from severe malnutrition. Jeffrey weighed just 21 pounds, less than what he had weighed years earlier when the Catholic Children's Aid Society had placed him in his grandparents' care. At just 5 years old, Jeffrey Baldwin was the size of a toddler. A child who had been meant to thrive away from his abusive parents. A child who had instead been left to waste away. Despite the best efforts of doctors at the hospital, Jeffrey Baldwin's frail body could take no more. His heart gave out, unable to withstand the years of neglect it had endured. He was just 6 weeks shy of his 6th birthday. His tiny body was transported to the medical examiner's office, where a team of forensic experts would uncover the horrors that had led to his slow, agonising death. Dr. Jim Cairns, the coroner, later described what he saw. The child was extremely emaciated. You could call it horrific.
One could literally see every single bone in his body, and the bones were as if it were a skeleton. And I'd literally never seen anything like that before.
It was immediately clear that Jeffrey had lived a life of unimaginable cruelty. His body told a story of prolonged abuse, a story of neglect that spanned years. He'd been systematically starved, his body wasting away, but it was pneumonia that had ultimately killed him. It hadn't developed overnight. His body was so weakened from starvation that he could no longer fight off infections. Fecal bacteria had entered his bloodstream, triggering septic shock that made breathing nearly impossible. That bacteria had come from his own skin, thick with filth. Jeffrey had likely placed his fingers into his mouth, unknowingly transferring the bacteria to his lungs. His suffering had been relentless. Open sores covered his fragile frame, scabbed over and broken again and again. His skin, cracked and raw, was a testament to years of neglect. There were no broken bones, no clear fractures, but his scalp was marred with deep bruises. He had suffered blunt force trauma. This hadn't been a single moment of violence. This had been a pattern, a slow, deliberate breaking of a child's body and spirit. The starvation hadn't started days or weeks before. It had begun as long as 4 years earlier. Jeffrey had just been a toddler when his grandparents took him in. They were supposed to be his rescuers, but it was clear they had actually been his tormentors. Dr. Cairns compared the state of Jeffrey's body to that of an elderly nursing home patient, somebody in their 90s, frail and confused, scratching at themselves until their skin broke open. The parallels were horrifying. The doctor admitted, "There are certain details I don't want to go into, but a 5-year-old does not die of pneumonia. It's the factors which lead up to the pneumonia which are being investigated." And those factors all pointed to one inescapable truth. Jeffrey Baldwin hadn't died by accident. He'd been murdered. After Jeffrey's death, an investigation was launched into the conditions that he had endured. Authorities returned to the home where he had taken his last breath. It was a comfortable home, at least outwardly. There were 2 computers, warm bedrooms, and the appearance of normalcy. Dr. David Giddens, who was part of the investigation, later recalled, "No one was upset. There was no anxiety. Life seemed normal, like nothing had happened, nothing untoward." But the illusion of normalcy shattered when they stepped inside the 3rd bedroom. A different world existed behind that door. A world of horror. A high hook was mounted on the outside of the door, a lock to keep somebody in. Inside, the room was dark and cold. Unlike the rest of the home, there was no carpet, no decorations. The walls were bare. The air was thick with the suffocating stench of urine and faeces. On the floor lay a single mattress, soaking wet with urine and encrusted with dried faeces. A garbage bag sat in the corner, filled with soiled diapers. A dog bowl containing remnants of food was the only sign of sustenance. There were no toys, no children's clothing. Nothing to suggest that a child had ever lived there. But 2 had. This was where Jeffrey and his sister Laura had spent their existence. Both were developmentally disabled, and for that they had been cast aside. While the other children lived in warmth, Jeffrey and Laura were locked away in filth and isolation. The investigation uncovered the depths of their suffering. Botno and Kidman had been receiving monthly payments from the Catholic Children's Aid Society to care for their grandchildren. Instead, they had starved, beaten, and tormented them. Jeffrey and Laura were confined to their filthy, unheated prison on the 2nd floor. They were locked inside for hours, days, without access to a bathroom. A young neighbour, Zachary, later recalled, "I was in the bathroom one day, and through a vent by the toilet, I heard them moaning and groaning, a soft cry. A sound of suffering hidden behind closed doors." Jeffrey and Laura were subjected to relentless cruelty. They were beaten with metal spoons until their buttocks bled. They were stripped naked and washed with freezing water from a hose. They were forced to eat their own vomit. If they didn't clean quickly enough, they were beaten with a stick. Sometimes they were simply crying in their cribs when Botno and Kidman struck them. They weren't children to their grandparents. They were called names. Jeffrey was a dog and Laura was a pig. Their sister Sarah recalled,
"My grandma always had to clean up the bedroom, and she had to clean up the poo, and it stank in there, and it's like a pig pen. It's called a pig, and it's called a dog."
The 2 siblings were dehumanized, treated as less than nothing. The other children were warned, don't be like them. They were told never to speak about Jeffrey and Laura, not to the teachers, not to anyone, in case someone came looking, in case someone uncovered the truth.
"How come you weren't allowed to talk about Jeffrey at school?"
I just wasn't. They didn't want the children's aid coming and taking him away.
Why would Children's Aid come and take him away?
Because of the bad things that they were doing to us.
Along with Botno and Kidman, there were 4 other adults living in the home. 2 of them were Jeffrey's aunts and the other 2 were their partners. One of them, James Mills, later told detectives a horrifying truth. Jeffrey was kept as a dog. He was forbidden from going downstairs, so he drank from the toilet. Mills recollected. He would have to go to the bathroom on the floor in his room. That's why there was a horrendous stench coming from that room. He said that Jeffrey would have been treated better at an animal shelter. The cruelty extended beyond neglect. Mills remembered a time that he was instructed to take Jeffrey and the other children into the basement. They were to stay there for 5 hours. The adults needed to talk about family politics. There was no bathroom in the basement. If the children needed to relieve themselves, they were told to use a bucket. Mills also recalled a chilling conversation with Bottineau. She told him she couldn't seek help for Jeffrey because it would ruin the check she had received each month to care for him. On the rare occasion that Jeffrey received any food, it was scraps. He ate from a dog bowl without a knife or fork. In the days leading up to its death, Jeffrey was falling. He could barely walk. He struggled up the stairs. He needed help just to stand. But Bottineau didn't see a starving child. She saw a problem. She called him lazy.
My grandma placed him at the table, and he fell down, and my grandpa started yelling at my grandma and saying my grandma thought that I was just being lazy.
Detectives pressed James Mills. They were asked why he hadn't reported the abuse or helped Jeffrey and his sister. His answer was simple. He didn't want to be kicked out of the house. When confronted with the disturbing evidence, Jeffrey's grandparents had excuses. They said that he was a troubled child. They called him borderline retarded. Kidman told detectives, "He always eats well, a very good eater. Jeffrey is, always was, always a good eater." But this completely contradicted what Bottineau said and the evidence. She claimed that Jeffrey would throw himself on the floor and starve himself. She said he refused to eat. They both insisted that he was impossible to toilet train, and that was their excuse for keeping him locked away. They said he wouldn't be accepted into school because of it. Kidman even admitted to locking Jeffrey in the room at night. He claimed that it was to stop him from sneaking out and drinking from the toilet. They removed all the furniture from his room and said he would smear faeces on his clothing. They painted Jeffrey as difficult and unmanageable. But their lies crumbled against the truth. Jeffrey's tiny, starved body told the real story. Jeffrey's grandparents, Elva Bottineau and Norma Kidman, weren't arrested immediately after his death. It wasn't until March the next year that Toronto homicide detectives determined there was enough evidence to charge them. Both were arrested and charged with first-degree murder and forcible confinement. As news of the arrest spread, Bottineau's lawyer was quick to defend her in the media. He claimed that she had been devastated by Jeffrey's death, and was even more devastated to be accused of causing it. But Jeffrey's body had told a story that was impossible to ignore. He had been starved, beaten, locked away, and neglected for years. And as investigators dug deeper, it became clear that what happened to Jeffrey wasn't an isolated case of neglect. It was part of a long and horrifying pattern, one that stretched back decades. Bottineau and Kidman both had criminal records for child abuse. But somehow this history had gone unnoticed when they were given custody of Jeffrey and his siblings. The Catholic Children's Aid Society, also known as CCAS, had placed 2 vulnerable children in the care of people who should have been nowhere near them. Bottineau's past was especially alarming. In 1970, when she was just 19 years old, she had been charged with assaulting her 5-month-old daughter, Eva. At the time, CCAS had already flagged Bottineau and her then husband as unfit parents with no desire for change. She was given a 1-year probation service, but what happened to Eva was far worse. Eva had died of pneumonia not long after, just like Jeffrey. But her autopsy revealed something far more disturbing. Multiple fractures in her shoulders, elbows and wrists. The injuries had never been treated. They'd likely gone unnoticed until the coroner began his examination. Despite this, Bottineau went on to have more children. She'd grown up in a chaotic, abusive household herself, the 7th of 16 siblings. She'd witnessed her father attack her mother with an axe and almost sever one of her breasts. She was sexually abused by both her stepfather and her brother. At 16, she was kicked out of the house after she became pregnant with her first child. Her early adulthood followed a similar pattern of instability. She married a distant cousin and had 3 children with him before leaving him in 1975 for Norman Kidman. Together, they had 3 more children. Kidman's background was no less troubling. In 1978, he was convicted of assaulting 2 of Bottineau's children from her previous relationship. He received 2 years probation. A psychiatric report at the time described him as a mixed-up and anxious man who struggled with the role of being a father. Despite their record, CCAS continued to monitor the couple over the years, but they never took action to remove any children from their care. In fact, in 1984, CCAS released a report that painted a very different picture of the household. Bottineau and Kidman were described as well-meaning and good parents. Bottineau had even been given work looking after children in her home, a job she secured with CCAS's support. Just 2 years later, concerns resurfaced. A child under their care reported being sexually abused. No charges were ever filed. Then in 2000, another complaint surfaced, this time from a teenager living in the home who claimed to have been sexually assaulted. Again, no charges were ever filed and no further investigation was conducted. 2 years later, Jeffrey was dead. Somehow, despite their history, despite the repeated red flags, despite years of reports and allegations, Bottineau and Kidman had been granted custody of 2 vulnerable children. And nobody had stopped to ask why. It was decided that Elva Bottineau and Norman Kidman would stand trial together for the murder of Jeffrey Baldwin. The trial began on the 9th of September 2005. As the couple were escorted into the courtroom, they took their seats beside their respective defence teams. The public gallery slowly filled with onlookers, journalists, legal professionals, and those who had followed the case in horror. But there was nobody there for Jeffrey. No grieving family, no relative seeking justice. He had died alone, and now he was being tried alone. Prosecutor Bev Richards stood before the judge, the weight of the case evident in her words. There was no jury. Instead, Mr. Justice David Watt would be deciding the fate of Bottineau and Kidman. Richards wasted no time in painting a brutal picture of Jeffrey's life. She said to the court, his life was something straight out of a horror movie. He was kept as a dog. He was skin and bone. He and his sister were locked in the room. She introduced Dr. Stanley Zlotkin, a specialist who had studied malnutrition in some of the most impoverished countries in the world. He'd worked in Bangladesh, Pakistan and Ghana, places where starvation was a grim reality, and yet when he examined Jeffrey's case, he called it one of the most severe cases of malnutrition he had seen in Canada or even the developing world. Richards detailed how Bottineau and Kidman had reduced Jeffrey and his sister to nothing more than financial assets. She kept them isolated, she said. She never got help for them because she was afraid they were going to call CAS and they would take away her monthly check. That check amounted to $600 a month, money that was given to Bottineau to provide for the children. Instead, it became the price of their suffering. She then turned to the other adults in the home. None of them had intervened. None of them had saved Jeffrey. To them, he was invisible. It was like he wasn't even there to half the people in the house, the prosecutor said. The neglect had been so extreme that even the neighbours didn't know that Jeffrey existed. He'd been hidden away, locked behind doors, wasting away in silence. His death hadn't been quick. It had been slow and torturous. It was almost like a death march. He was waiting to die, Richards told the court. Then the evidence began. Dr. Stanley Zlotkin took the stand. As he spoke, graphic photographs of Jeffrey's body were displayed to the courtroom. There was a quiet gasp from the gallery. Even seasoned professionals, used to the grim realities of crime scene photos, weren't prepared for the images in front of them. Dr. Slotkin testified, "You're literally seeing his patella, or knee bone, sticking out. One can literally see every bone in his rib cage." He described his initial reaction upon receiving Jeffrey's medical records. "I thought there had been a mistake," he admitted. His weight and height were so low. He paused before adding, "This child was likely chronically starving." Another photograph was then presented. It was Jeffrey as he should have been, a cherubic little boy in pyjamas, baby fat still padding his cheeks and belly. "The contrast for anyone's eyes is dramatic," Dr. Slotkin said. He explained that in the days and possibly even weeks leading up to his death, Jeffrey had likely been in a semi-conscious state. His body had begun shutting down. He could no longer walk. He couldn't even climb the stairs.
This occurred over a long period of time. We're talking about years. And it was a severe deprivation, not a minor deprivation.
As the graphic images continued, Kidman briefly looked up, but his face betrayed nothing. No emotion, no guilt. His defence attorney, Robert Richardson, attempted to push back. He suggested that Jeffrey had starved himself for emotional reasons, that his condition was self-inflicted. Dr. Slotkin didn't hesitate in shutting the claim down. There was an absence in Jeffrey's bone marrow, he said. That condition would have taken at least a year to develop. A child, he explained, could not self-impose that level of starvation. After Dr. Slotkin stepped down, the prosecution called Osiris Villabalos to the stand. As an investigator with the Catholic Children's Aid Society, he'd seen neglect before, but nothing like this. Osiris said he had been at the hospital the night that Jeffrey died. He had seen the boy's tiny lifeless body firsthand. Even now, standing in a courtroom, the memory was too much to bear. He swallowed hard, his voice unsteady as he recalled the moment he arrived at the Baldwin home. "I couldn't believe it," he told the judge. His composure cracked when he described Jeffrey's so-called bedroom, a barren, filthy space with nothing but a soiled mattress. He paused, struggling to collect himself before he continued. Every adult in that house knew what was happening to Jeffrey, and every single one of them failed to report it. Then came the testimony of paramedic Mark Dugas, one of the first responders that night. He described the frantic efforts to revive Jeffrey, the desperate attempts to get his heart beating again. But what haunted him wasn't just the futility of those efforts, it was the apathy. Not a single adult had asked about Jeffrey's condition. Not one of them had gone to the hospital with him. As if the boy they had let waste away wasn't worth saving at all. The pathologist, Dr. Gregory Wilson, took the stand next. His voice was clinical, detached, but there was no disguising the horror in his findings. Jeffrey, he said, resembled a child half his age. A 2.5-year-old, not a boy approaching his 6th birthday. But that wasn't the worst of it. Wilson spoke of the grime that coated Jeffrey's body, a hardened, caked-on layer of bacteria that had built up over time. In all my years, I'd never seen anything like it, he said. Then, the most disturbing discovery of all, fecal bacteria in Jeffrey's lungs. Wilson explained, "We all aspirate small amounts of bacteria, but our bodies can clear them. In Jeffrey's case, the amount was much greater." It meant one thing. Jeffrey had been breathing in filth, likely for years. Dr. Wilson had been a pathologist for 2 decades, but he didn't hesitate when he said, "This was the most extreme cases I have ever seen." The courtroom was silent. He couldn't say exactly how long Jeffrey had been starving, but his best estimate was up to 4 years. 4 years of hunger, 4 years of suffering, 4 years of being treated as if he didn't exist. Then the prosecution introduced yet another chilling piece of evidence. Constable Ian Kennedy took to the stand and recounted a conversation he had overheard just hours after Jeffrey was pronounced dead. It had happened in the back of his police cruiser. Jeffrey's biological mother, Yvonne, sat with her mother, Bottineau. Her son had just died, his body wasn't yet cold, and yet, she only had one thing on her mind. "I wonder if his insurance will cover him. I have insurance," she said. Bottineau's response was just as callous. "That's accidental death. I don't know if he's covered." Even in death, Jeffrey had been nothing more than a check. And now, the people who let him waste away were being forced to answer for it. On the second week of the trial, the prosecution called James Mills to the witness stand. Mills had already given detectives a detailed account of the horrors that unfolded inside the Baldwin home. But here, in court, he was different. He answered questions with vague responses, claiming he couldn't recall the details of the statements he had made. It wasn't until the judge intervened that his demeanour shifted. Suddenly, he remembered. He spoke of Jeffrey's frailty, how the little boy had been so weak he had to crawl up the stairs, one agonising step at a time. He told the judge he was just dollars and cents to them. The kids were her only source of income. She didn't want to lose that and would do anything in her power not to. Then he recalled the night that Jeffrey died. It was around 2 a.m. and he heard Jeffrey crying from his bedroom. Unable to sleep, he turned to his girlfriend and whispered a chilling prediction. "I don't believe Jeffrey's long for this world." Not long after that, the house fell silent. When asked why he hadn't intervened, Mills simply shrugged. He said, "It wasn't my place. Who am I to judge what happened in that house?" As the trial progressed, even more disturbing details about Jeffrey's final moments and the unimaginable suffering he endured came to light. After his death, his siblings were removed from the home and placed into foster care. In the safety of their new surroundings, they began to talk. Pauline Simpson, a foster mother who took in Jeffrey's younger brother, testified that the boy had confided in her about the beatings. "He beats his ass real good sometimes," he had said. The beatings, they learned, had been punishment for the smallest infractions, like defecating in the bedroom when he had nowhere else to go. Jeffrey's brother Julian described how he and his sister were deprived of blankets and heat whenever they were deemed bad. They were cast out, treated as though they weren't even human. Susan Borelli Cisterna, who fostered Jeffrey's two sisters and younger brother in the hours after his death, recalled the conversation between them that revealed just how normalised the abuse had become. Julian had said, "Grandfather was upset because Jeffrey defecated all over the place. He's going to get beat." His older sister Sarah quickly cut him off and said, "You need to shut up. That's for us to know and for them to find out." But eventually, even Sarah spoke. She told her foster mother that on the day that Jeffrey died, he'd been so weak that he kept stumbling into the furniture. She described how Bottineau had wrapped him up in a blanket, carried him upstairs, and then, before trying to force feed him milk, spanked him and yanked him by the hair. Then as Jeffrey lay dying, Bottineau had ordered Sarah to bring her nail varnish. As more evidence surfaced, it became clear just how broken these children were by the time they were rescued. The little girl who had been kept locked in the bedroom with Jeffrey had been observed drinking from the toilet. She ate with her hands, scavenged food from the garbage, and had no understanding of how to sit at a table for a meal. When she was allowed to sit alongside the other children in foster care, Sarah was horrified. "Pigs eat on the floor," she told her foster mother. "Pigs don't share the table." Jeffrey and his sister had been the pigs. After every meal at their grandparents' home, the family would scrape their leftovers into a dog bowl. When the others had finished eating, Jeffrey and his sister would be allowed to crawl over and eat whatever remained.
You said that Jeffrey would get the leftovers. Where would the leftovers come from?
From people's plate who didn't finish their supper, didn't want it anymore. They would put it in a bowl and then give it to Jeffrey.
There was also another darker allegations. One of the sisters alluded to something terrible happening in the bathroom. Bad things happen in the tub, she said. She pointed to her genitals and named Kidman. The other children described how he would beat them with a metal spoon until their buttocks bled. How Jeffrey and his sister were always the bad kids, while the others were considered the good kids. And then the words that left the courtroom in stunned silence. Sarah said, "Everyone knew that Jeffrey was going to die." After the prosecution rested, the defence presented their case. Elva Botnow's attorney, Anil Kapoor, argued that his client lacked the mental capacity to raise children. He pointed to a psychiatric evaluation from the 1970s, conducted during her previous criminal conviction, which had classified her as having borderline mental retardation, with an IQ below 80. Dr. Nathan Pollock, a defence expert, testified that Botnow suffered from both narcissistic and histrionic personality disorders. He suggested that these conditions had impaired her ability to recognise that Jeffrey was on the brink of death. Dr. Pollock told the courtroom, "It's difficult to imagine what it's like to have those limitations. She doesn't come up with what the average person comes up with in solutions." However, Dr. Lisa Ramshaw, who testified for the prosecution, refuted this claim. She argued that Botnow had deliberately exaggerated her cognitive limitations during evaluations in an effort to appear less capable than she actually was. According to Dr. Ramshaw, Botnow could read at a 7th grade level and spell at an 8th grade level, evidence that she was far from the helpless, incapable figure that the defence sought to portray. And with that, the defence rested. During closing arguments, the defence team insisted that Botnow and Kidman had never intended on killing Jeffrey. Robert Richardson, Kidman's attorney, acknowledged that his client had done nothing to stop the abuse, but maintained that child-rearing duties had been left entirely to Botnow. Kidman spent most of his time in front of the television. "He's grossly negligent, but not murderous," his defence attorney said. Now, the decision rested solely with Justice David Watt. In April, his verdict was announced. Elva Botnow and Norman Kidman were found guilty of second-degree murder. In his ruling, Justice Watt made it clear that Jeffrey's death had not been the result of mere negligence. It had been prolonged, deliberate cruelty. Jeffrey Baldwin didn't just miss a meal or two, he said. He painted a heartbreaking picture of a once healthy baby boy, blonde-haired and chubby, who had wasted away under the neglect of the very people who were supposed to protect him. Both the system and the adults in his life had failed him. Jeffrey had as much disappeared from the world into the reeking black hole that was bedroom number 2 in his grandparents' home. There was food for others, but not for him. There was warmth for others, but not for him. There were neighbourhood children for others to play with, but not for him, Justice Watt said. For Jeffrey Baldwin, in his short and tragic life, there'd never been much of anything at all. Elva Botnow and Norman Kidman were sentenced to life in prison. Botnow was ordered to serve 22 years before becoming eligible for parole. Kidman was ordered to serve 20. That means that in the upcoming few years, both have a shot at parole. After the sentencing, it was announced that an inquest would be held to examine the role of the Catholic Children's Aid Society in Jeffrey Baldwin's case. Before the inquest began, both the CCAS and Jeffrey's grandparents were sued for negligence on behalf of his surviving siblings and cousins. Meanwhile, Elva Botnow and Norman Kidman appealed their convictions. Botnow's appeal rested on the claim that she was too unintelligent to understand that depriving Jeffrey of food would ultimately kill him. However, Associate Chief Justice Dennis O'Connor dismissed the argument, noting that she had been capable enough to properly care for the other children in the household. Kidman, on the other hand, attempted to shift all of the blame onto Botnow, claiming that she ruled the home with an iron fist and was solely responsible for the children. Both of their appeals were denied. In September of 2013, the coroner's inquest began. By this time, significant reforms had already been implemented within the CCAS and the child welfare agencies across Ontario. These included stricter background checks, mandatory reviews of family history, and the requirement that relatives acting as caregivers meet the same standards as foster and adoptive parents. Previously, the system had been far more relaxed, so much so that Jeffrey and his sister were handed over to their grandparents without any oversight. This was despite both Bottineau and Kidman having criminal convictions for child abuse, and despite the fact that Bottineau had previously caused the death of one of her own daughters. Retired Detective Michael Davis, who had investigated Jeffrey's murder, testified that the case would haunt him for the rest of his life. He reflected on James Mills's harrowing testimony at trial, recounting the devastating image of Jeffrey's last moments. He said, "He was trying to make his way up the stairs, crawling up the stairs as his little pyjamas were falling off his hips because he had no hips. You deal with it, but you don't forget it. That's what makes you angry when you see something like this. What makes me even more angry is the fact it could have been prevented." Other witnesses also spoke about the lasting impact of the case. Paramedic Mark Douglas, who had responded to the scene, described the horror of what he had witnessed. "You see something like that, and it's just soul-destroying. It was the complete and utter destruction of dignity to any child or any human being, in my opinion." He admitted that the memory of Jeffrey's emaciated, battered body haunted him at night. As the inquest progressed, systemic failures became glaringly apparent. It was revealed that once Bottineau and Kidman had been granted custody of the children, CCAS had closed their file. No caseworker ever followed up, and no one ever checked on the well-being of the children. Even more disturbingly, no background checks had ever been conducted on the couple. No one had run a criminal record search, nor had anyone reviewed past child welfare reports, which would have revealed Bottineau and Kidman's long history of abuse. The testimony at the inquest mirrored much of what had been heard during the trial. However, more evidence of abuse came to light. Decades earlier, when Kidman was convicted of abusing two of Bottineau's children, they had been removed from their care. The extent of their suffering was staggering. They were confined to a bedroom, often locked in dog cages, and forced to wear dog collars. They weren't allowed to use a proper bathroom and instead had to relieve themselves in a potty in the corner of the room. When it became full, nobody emptied it. They were forced to go on the floor. Whenever they complained of the cold, Bottineau would strike them and say, "Too bad." They were forced to drink their own urine and were severely underfed. As punishment, they were made to stand in the corner for hours, sometimes even days without moving. This was 24 years before Jeffrey's death, yet the similarities between the past abuse and the conditions that Jeffrey and his sister endured were chilling. Unlike at the trial, Jeffrey's biological parents testified. His father, Richard Baldwin, admitted he knew something was terribly wrong the last time that he saw his son. But he said he felt powerless to intervene, as the system had painted Jeffrey's grandparents as model caregivers. Richard tearfully recalled Jeffrey's playful spirit, stating, "He wanted to fly. He tried jumping off the chair. We had to make him stop. He dressed up as Superman for Halloween one year. He was so excited. I have that picture at home hanging on my wall. He was our little man of steel." He spoke about how his son had once loved hugs and kisses, but after being sent to live with his grandparents, he likely only received affection when he visited his parents. When asked why he never sought help for Jeffrey, Richard's response was heartbreaking. During the initial investigation, he had described his son as looking like an Ethiopian child due to his extreme malnourishment. But in his words, "I didn't think he was going to die." Jeffrey's mother, Yvonne Kidman, took to the stand and spoke about the years leading up to her son's death. She claimed that her mother had always threatened to take her children away and insisted she never intended for Jeffrey and his siblings to be permanently placed with Bottineau and Kidman. According to Yvonne, she and Richard were young, struggling parents who felt they had no choice but to hand the children over. They couldn't afford legal representation and her mother had promised that it was temporary. But the reality, she alleged, was much different. Yvonne told the court that Bottineau only wanted custody to remain in social housing and that she had no idea about her parents' history of abuse. She said, "If I would have known about all this stuff, I wouldn't put my kids in that spot."
As far as I know, my whole life is a lie.
Mm-hmm.
There's a lot of secrets. And so far with the court that's going on right now, the criminal court case, it's all coming out. And it's very shocking to me, I tell you one thing.
However, the court heard that Yvonne herself had been under the supervision of a Catholic Children's Aid Society as a child. A social worker had monitored her throughout her youth, but she had never been told the truth. She believed that the woman was simply her sister's godmother. She questioned why, if things were that bad, she and her siblings had never been removed from the home. Freya Christensen, the lawyer representing Jeffrey's surviving siblings, responded, "I think that's one of the questions we all have." The inquest ultimately revealed a series of failures by social services. Red flags were ignored, background checks weren't done. Because the arrangements had initially been informal, social workers failed to conduct proper screenings before allowing Jeffrey and his siblings to live with their grandparents. CCAS workers had even considered foster care, but ultimately believed that sending the children to Bottineau and Kidman was the better option. It was a decision that sealed Jeffrey's fate. On the second week of the inquest, Bottineau testified. She denied any responsibility for Jeffrey's death, insisting that she disagreed with the idea that she had played a role. She claimed she would have disclosed their criminal past if only social workers had asked. As for how her own daughter had suffered fractures when she died, she had no explanation. "I'm not a child beater," she told the court. With that, the inquest drew to a close. In total, 74 recommendations were put forward. They included mandatory public awareness campaigns about reporting child abuse, enhanced training programs for child welfare supervisors, and even integrating lessons on abuse and neglect into school curriculums. Better information sharing between children's aid societies was also emphasised. Coroner's counsel Jill Wilkins said, "Jeffrey Baldwin received far more attention after his death than he ever did in his life." But the jury went even further, recommending additional measures. Among them, even if a child protection case is closed, workers should still conduct annual check-ins for children under 5 living with alternate caregivers. They also urged the Ministry of Children and Youth Services to conduct a full review of child protection standards, including kinship care policies. Perhaps the most significant recommendation, however, was the proposal to merge all of Ontario's child welfare agencies into one central body, an effort to prevent another tragedy like Jeffrey's from ever happening again. Because of Jeffrey, sweeping changes were made to Ontario's child welfare system. His cherubic face, once full of life, and his emaciated frame in death became symbols of a system that had failed him. The reforms meant that he would never be forgotten, that no child should ever suffer as he had. And indeed, Jeffrey wasn't forgotten. A memorial statue was created in his honour depicting him as a superhero, complete with the Superman shield, an image of the little boy who once dreamed of flying. It was unveiled at Greenwood Park in October of 2014. Todd Boyce, the local father who raised funds for the statue, spoke to the crowd gathered in Jeffrey's memory. There's so much support and compassion for Jeffrey, so much that he didn't have in his life, but he has it now. The statue stands as a tribute to the child the world failed to protect. A little boy who wanted to be Superman, but no one came to save him. Well, besties, that is it for this episode of Morbidology. As always, thank you so much for listening, and I'd like to say a big, massive thank you to my newest supporter up on Patreon, Brittany. As you all know, Morbidology is just a one-woman team, so the support up on there seriously goes such a long way, and I really am eternally grateful. This case is one that I've written about before up on my website, and it's one of them ones that just sticks with you from the second you hear about it. I'd love to know your thoughts on this case, so feel free to join Morbidology's private Facebook group and share your thoughts. If y'all didn't know, Morbidology is also now up on YouTube, and the episodes are just the same as the podcast episodes, but they're presented in a documentary style video along with videos, photos, and whatever else I can find associated with the case. So if you'd like to, please head on over there and hit that subscribe button. Remember to check us out at morbidology.com for more information about this episode and to read some true crime articles. Until next time, take care of yourselves, stay safe, and have an amazing week.